I'm Rachel Michelle, 32 years old, and last month I buried my father, the hardest working man I've ever known. Along with grief came the stress of dealing with my brother James, who's spent years reminding me that Dad's business and house will obviously go to the son. He actually smirked at me during the funeral. What James didn't know was that Dad had been making plans he never saw coming. Before I tell you how my entitled brother's smirk disappeared from his face when Dad's will was read, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, and hit subscribe if you've ever had to deal with toxic family members. Michelle Construction wasn't always the successful regional building company it became. My father, Robert Michelle, started with just a pickup truck, a toolbox, and an unrelenting work ethic that defined his entire life. I remember him coming home when I was little, his clothes covered in sawdust, hands calloused but still gentle enough to lift me for a hug. Hard work builds more than houses, Rachel, he would tell me. It builds character. Our family home was a testament to Dad's success, a beautiful colonial-style house built in the 1930s with high ceilings, brown molding, and a wraparound porch where Mom used to read to James and me during summer evenings. It wasn't just a house. It was a landmark in our town of Riverdale, a symbol of classic American craftsmanship that Dad had lovingly restored room by room. Mom Grace was her name, and she embodied that quality was the heart of our family until cancer took her 10 years ago. I was 22 then, just finishing college, and her passing changed everything. She had been the buffer between James and Dad, between James and me. Without her, the fractures in our family became impossible to ignore. Even as a child, I was drawn to the family business. While other kids played house, I played construction company. Dad would sometimes take me to job sites on Saturdays, where I'd watch in fascination as buildings took shape. By age 10, I could read basic blueprints. By 14, I was helping in the office during summer breaks, filing paperwork and eventually learning bookkeeping from Marge, Dad's longtime office manager. "You've got a good head for business, Rach," Dad would say, pride evident in his voice. "You see the big picture, just like I do." James, 3 years older than me, couldn't have been less interested. While I was at the office, he was usually out with friends, returning home just in time for dinner. Dad tried to involve him, offering him summer jobs at the construction sites, trying to teach him the business, but James always had excuses. "Manual labor isn't really my thing, Dad," he'd say with a shrug. "I'm more of an ideas guy." The ideas rarely materialized into anything concrete, and when they did, they didn't last long. James started and abandoned interests with alarming frequency, a band that practiced twice before dissolving, a clothing line that never progressed beyond sketches, a screenplay that remained perpetually in development. By the time I entered high school, I had already decided to pursue a business degree with a focus on architecture. I wanted to understand both the creative and practical sides of construction. I worked summers and holidays at Michelle Construction, absorbing everything I could about contracts, client relations, materials, and management. Dad beamed when I was accepted to State University's business program. "She's going to take Michelle Construction to the next level," he told anyone who would listen. I don't think he realized how those comments affected James, whose own college career had been a series of changed majors and mediocre grades. When I graduated with honors, Dad and Mom's sister, Aunt Martha, were in the audience cheering. James didn't come. He had a music festival that weekend that he couldn't miss. Dad tried to hide his disappointment, but I saw it clearly when he scanned the seats before the ceremony, still hoping his son might surprise us. "Your brother will find his way eventually," Dad said as we celebrated over dinner that evening. "Some people take longer to figure out their path." But there was something in his eyes, a resignation, perhaps, that suggested he was trying to convince himself more than me. That night, as he toasted my achievement, I glimpsed for the first time that his dreams for the family business might be shifting from his son to his daughter. After graduation, I had offers from several established architecture and construction firms in bigger cities. The salary packages were impressive, nearly double what I could make starting at Michelle Construction. But when Dad asked if I'd consider coming home to help grow the family business, I didn't hesitate. "I've been preparing for this my whole life," I told him. "Those other jobs will always be there if this doesn't work out." His eyes had misted over, though he quickly blinked it away. Robert Michelle wasn't one to show emotion easily. "Well, I can't promise it'll be easy," he said gruffly. "You'll have to earn the respect of every contractor and client who thinks construction is a man's world." "I know," I said, "but I had a good teacher." Those first few years working officially at Michel Construction were challenging but rewarding. I brought fresh ideas implementing project management software that streamlined our operations, creating a website that showcased our work, developing green building initiatives that attracted environmentally conscious clients. Dad was hesitant at first. We've done fine with paper contracts for 30 years, but he couldn't argue with the results. Within 3 years, we had increased our business by 30%. Our project completion rate was higher, client satisfaction was up, and we were attracting better talent. Dad gave me more responsibility, eventually making me project manager, then operations director. James, meanwhile, had cycled through 3 jobs since college. He worked briefly at a marketing agency before being let go during cutbacks, then tried his hand at real estate but couldn't maintain the discipline required to build a client base. His third venture was a sports bar he opened with friends, which closed after 18 months of mismanagement. Each failure brought him back to Dad's door, asking for loans that we all knew would never be. "It's not fair," I confronted Dad after he wrote James a check for $15,000 to cover debts from the failed bar. "You're enabling him." "He's my son, Rachel," Dad said wearily. "What am I supposed to do, let him drown?" "Maybe hitting bottom would be the best thing for him. He's 35, Dad. When is he going to stand on his own feet?" Dad had no answer, just a sad shrug that made him look suddenly older. Despite his financial struggles, James maintained an air of entitlement that baffled me. He drove a luxury car he couldn't afford, wore designer clothes, and took vacations he had to put on credit cards. Whenever he visited the office, usually to ask Dad for money, he acted as if he was doing us a favor by gracing us with his presence. "The Michel Construction heir has arrived," Marge would mutter sarcastically when he sauntered in. The employees all knew who actually kept the business running. They came to me with problems, ideas, and questions, even when Dad was available. They trusted my judgment and respected my work ethic. James noticed this too, and it clearly bothered him. "They're just sucking up to you, because they know Dad likes you best right now," he told me once after a site supervisor had ignored his suggestion in favor of my approach. "But when Dad retires and I take over, things will change around here." I was so stunned I couldn't even respond. The delusion that he would someday run the company despite having contributed nothing to it was so complete it was almost impressive. The incident that finally opened Dad's eyes happened 3 years ago. We had landed our biggest contract, yet a multimillion-dollar commercial development that would put Michel Construction in a new league. James, between ventures again and temporarily working in our sales department at Dad's insistence, had somehow convinced Dad to let him lead the client meeting to review the initial plan. "Give him a chance to prove himself," Dad had said when I objected. "He needs a win, Rachel." The meeting was a disaster. James hadn't reviewed the plans thoroughly, couldn't answer basic questions about timelines and materials, and worst of all had promised unrealistic completion dates to impress the client. By the time I was called in to salvage the situation, the client was ready to walk. I spent 3 hours going through every detail, reassuring them that James didn't speak for the company's official position, and rebuilding the trust he had shattered in 30 minutes of unprepared overconfidence. When the client's left contract still intact, thankfully Dad called us both into his office. "What happened out there?" he demanded of James. "The clients were being unreasonable," James said dismissively. "They expected me to know every little detail about some plumbing fixture. That's what we have contractors for." Dad's face reddened. "Those little details are the difference between a professional operation and an amateur one. You nearly cost us the biggest contract in company history because you couldn't be bothered to prepare." "Whatever," James muttered. Rachel swooped in to save the day as usual. The golden child strikes again. Dad slammed his hand on the desk. "This isn't about Rachel. This is about you and your consistent lack of responsibility. I gave you an opportunity to step up, and you failed. Not because you couldn't do it, but because you didn't try." It was the first time I'd ever seen Dad truly angry with James. Usually, he made excuses for him or looked the other way. But this time, the consequences had been too severe to ignore. After that, James's role at Michel Construction became increasingly ceremonial. Dad still kept him on the payroll, he's family, Rachel, but he no longer entrusted him with anything important. James seemed almost relieved to be relegated to the sidelines, though his resentment toward me grew more palpable by the day. Despite having no real responsibilities, he maintained the fiction that he was being groomed to take over. "Dad's just waiting until I'm ready," he would tell people at industry events. "The Michelle name needs to stay with the Michelle son." I tried to ignore these comments, focusing instead on the growing business and my partnership with Dad, which strengthened as his trust in me deepened. But I couldn't help wondering sometimes, did Dad really intend to hand everything over to James someday, simply because he was the son? After all I had contributed, all I had built, would biology trump merit when it came time for Dad to plan his succession? I never asked. Part of me was afraid of the answer. The call came on a Tuesday morning. I was at the office early, reviewing bids for an upcoming project, when Dad's doctor's number flashed on my phone. Dad had gone in for what was supposed to be a routine checkup the day before. "Miss Misha? This is Dr. Brennan. Your father asked me to call you directly." That's when I knew it was bad. Dad would have called himself with good news. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, already spread to the liver, 6 months, maybe less. The floor seemed to drop out from under me. Dad, the strongest person I knew, who had never taken a sick day in 40 years of running his business, was dying. I found him in his workshop behind the house, carefully sanding a jewelry box he was making for Aunt Martha's birthday. He looked up when I entered, saw my face, and nodded slowly. "So Dr. Brennan called you. Why didn't you call me yourself?" My voice cracked. "Why did you make the doctor do it?" He set down his sandpaper and sighed. "Because I couldn't bear to hear your voice break like it just did." We talked for hours that day about treatment options few, clinical trials he wasn't interested, and how to handle the business during his illness. Not once did he mention dying, though it hung in the air between us, an unwelcome shadow that wouldn't disperse. "I don't want to spend my remaining time in hospitals," he said firmly. "I want to work as long as I can. I want normal." So we established a new normal. Dad came to the office most mornings, stayed as long as his energy permitted, then I drove him home and brought work there when necessary. I took over more of the daily operations while keeping everyone informed that Dad was still the boss, still making the key decisions, even as those decisions gradually, naturally shifted to me. I called James as soon as I left Dad that first day, expecting him to be devastated, to rush over immediately. "That's awful," he said, and I heard genuine shock in his voice. "But they must have treatments, right? Chemo or something." "It's too advanced," I explained. "They can try to extend his time, make him more comfortable, but it's not curable at this stage." A long pause followed. "I'm in Phoenix right now," he finally said. "Business meeting, but I'll fly back tomorrow." James did fly back the next day, spent 2 hours with Dad, then returned to his apartment. He visited sporadically over the next few weeks, always with an excuse for why he couldn't stay longer, couldn't help more. Dad never complained, but I saw the hurt in his eyes when James would check his watch in the middle of a conversation, already mentally out the door. 3 months into Dad's illness, when the treatments were taking their toll and he had finally stepped back from daily involvement at the office, James suddenly developed an interest in the business. He started dropping by Michelle Construction, asking questions about projects, finances, client relationships. At first, I was hopeful maybe the reality of Dad's condition had finally shocked him into responsibility. Then I overheard him on the phone while I was dropping off some papers for Dad to review. "Yeah, the old man doesn't have much time left," James was saying, his voice inappropriately casual. "But once he's gone and I take over, we'll definitely revisit that resort idea. The company's worth millions now, and the house alone is probably worth 7 figures. No, my sister works there, but the business will come to me, Dad's traditional that way family name and all that." I stood frozen in the hallway, papers clutched to my chest, as anger and disbelief washed over me in alternating waves. Not only was James already planning how to spend his inheritance, but he was absolutely certain that everything would go to him despite his lifelong disinterest in the business I had helped build. That night, I found Dad sitting on the porch, wrapped in a blanket despite the mild evening. His weight loss was becoming more noticeable, his once robust frame increasingly fragile. "Dad," I said, sitting beside him, "we need to talk about what happens to the business after." He kept his gaze on the darkening sky. "I know. Have you made any plans, any decisions?" I tried to keep my voice neutral, but the conversation with James had shaken me more than I wanted to admit. Dad turned to me, his eyes tired but clear. "Do you trust me, Rachel?" "Of course I do." "Then trust that I've thought about this carefully, and I'll make the right decisions for everyone involved. He reached over and took my hand. You've never disappointed me. Not once in your entire life. Remember that, whatever happens. It wasn't the straightforward answer I'd hoped for, but I could see he wasn't going to say more on the subject. In the weeks that followed, Dad's condition deteriorated more rapidly than the doctors had predicted. I moved temporarily into the family home to care for him, working remotely when I could and relying heavily on our management team to keep projects moving. James visited more frequently as Dad weakened, but rarely stayed long enough to help with the actual caregiving. He would breeze in, tell Dad stories about business opportunities he was exploring, then leave before it was time for medications or doctor's appointments. After one such visit, when James had spent 15 minutes showing Dad brochures for a sports car he was thinking of buying, when things settled down, I confronted him in the driveway. He's dying, James. He needs his son present and accounted for, not planning purchases with money he doesn't even have yet. James had the decency to look momentarily ashamed before his expression hardened. I'm dealing with this in my own way, Rachel. We can't all be perfect like you. This isn't about being perfect. It's about being here, being present for the little time he has left. I'm here, aren't I? He gestured toward the house. But my life doesn't stop just because he's sick, and besides, he added, lowering his voice, we both know what's coming. Dad's getting his affairs in order. Thomas has been here twice this week. Thomas Wilson was Dad's lawyer and longtime friend. So I challenged. So it's going to be hard enough taking over the company without you fighting me every step of the way. Maybe if you're nice, I'll let you keep your job. He smirked, then slid into his car before I could respond. I stood in the driveway long after he'd driven away, trying to calm the storm of emotions his words had triggered. Was he right? Had Dad made the traditional choice after all? Would everything I'd worked for ultimately be handed to James simply because he was the son? That night, I heard Dad on the phone in his study, the door uncharacteristically closed. When he emerged an hour later, he seemed both exhausted and somehow lighter, as if a burden had been lifted. Everything okay? I asked as I helped him back to his bedroom. Just tying up loose ends, he said. Nothing for you to worry about. But there was something in his expression, a mixture of resolve and sadness, that made me wonder what decisions he had finalized behind that closed door. Dad died on a Sunday morning in early spring. The windows were open, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming magnolias from the tree he'd planted when I was born. I was holding his hand, reading aloud from his favorite Hemingway novel, when his breathing changed. I set the book aside and moved closer. It's okay, Dad, I whispered. You can rest now. His eyes opened briefly, found mine, and he managed the smallest of smiles before they closed again. 2 more breaths, and he was gone. I sat with him for a long time afterward, still holding his hand as it grew cold, trying to memorize the lines of his face, the now relaxed set of his jaw that had been so determined in life. I called the hospice nurse first, then Aunt Martha, and finally James. He's gone, I said when my brother answered. A pause. I'll be right over. 3 hours later, James finally arrived, by which time the funeral home had already come and gone. Aunt Martha was helping me sort through Dad's medications, deciding what to dispose of and what to return to the pharmacy. Where is he? James demanded as he burst through the door. They took him 2 hours ago, I said, too emotionally drained to muster anger at his tardiness. You should have waited for me, his voice rose accusingly. I'm his son, I had a right to say goodbye. Aunt Martha stepped between us. James, Rachel called you immediately. Robert had been gone for hours by the time you got here. I had to wrap up some things, he muttered defensively. Then, without missing a beat, have you talked to Thomas yet, about the will? I stared at him in disbelief. Dad hasn't been dead for 6 hours, and you're already asking about the will. We need to be practical, he insisted. The business has to keep running, decisions have to be made. The business is fine, I said coldly. I've been running it for months while caring for our dying father. It can wait a few days while we plan his funeral. James had the grace to look embarrassed, but I noticed he didn't offer to help with the funeral arrangements. Instead, he wandered through the house, lingering in Dad's study, opening drawers in his desk until Aunt Martha firmly suggested he give me space to grieve. The next few days passed in a blur of activity that somehow helped numb the pain. I selected a casket, wrote an obituary, coordinated with the church, and received a steady stream of visitors bringing food and condolences. The Michel construction employees were particularly supportive, showing up to clean the yard, bring meals, and offer to handle any work matters that couldn't wait. James made himself scarce until the day before the funeral, when he suddenly reappeared with opinions about everything I'd arranged. Maple casket, Dad would have wanted walnut, he critiqued. And these flowers are too somber. He wasn't a somber guy. Where were you when these decisions needed to be made? I finally snapped. I left you 6 messages asking for input. I was dealing with my grief in my own way, he said, as if this explained and excused his absence. The funeral itself was well attended, a testament to how many lives Dad had touched. The church overflowed with family, friends, employees, clients, and community members. The mayor gave a brief speech about Dad's contributions to the town, from buildings he'd constructed to charity work he quietly performed. I had asked James if he wanted to deliver a eulogy, but he declined, saying he was too emotional to speak publicly. So I stood alone at the pulpit, sharing memories of our father, his work ethic, his integrity, his quiet generosity, his love for his family and his community. Throughout the service, I caught James checking his phone, his attention clearly elsewhere. At the graveside, as they lowered Dad's casket, I noticed James scanning the crowd, nodding to business associates, already networking even in this solemn moment. The reception afterward was held at the family home. As people mingled, sharing stories about Dad, I overheard James in conversation with Frank, our project manager. "I'll want to review all the current projects once I take over," James was saying confidently. "Probably make some changes to how things are run." Frank, who had worked with Dad for 20 years and had trained me personally, looked uncomfortable. "You might want to talk to Rachel about that. She's been managing those projects for a while now." "Rachel works for the company," James replied dismissively. "I'll be owning the company, big difference." I walked away before I could hear more, not trusting myself to respond civilly. Throughout the reception, James continued to position himself as the heir apparent, accepting condolences with the air of a crown prince ascending to the throne. As the last guests were leaving, James cornered me in the kitchen. "I called Thomas," he said without preamble. "The will reading is scheduled for Friday at 10. "You called him?" "Today. I was putting leftovers away, trying to create order in at least this small corner of my appended world. Like I said, we need to be practical. The business can't wait in limbo while you process your feelings." I set down the container I was holding and turned to face him fully. "What exactly do you think is going to happen on Friday, James?" He shrugged with affected casualness. "Dad will have left things in order. The house, the business, everything will transition smoothly." "To you," I said flatly. "You think everything will transition smoothly to you?" "Dad always wanted his son to inherit the family name and business," he said, repeating the line I'd heard so many times. "You were just the backup." The callousness of his statement, on the very day we'd buried our father, struck me like a physical blow. But I refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing me react. "I guess we'll find out on Friday," I said quietly, and resumed putting away food as if he wasn't there. Later that night, alone in my childhood bedroom, I finally allowed myself to break down completely. I cried for Dad, for the future guidance I would never receive, for the grandchildren he would never meet. But I also cried for myself, for the fear that despite everything, my dedication, my hard work, the relationship I'd built with Dad, blood and tradition might still trump merit. That James might be right after all. Friday morning dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect spring day Dad would have appreciated. I dressed carefully in a navy suit he had always liked, a small tribute he would never see. As I was preparing to leave for Thomas Wilson's office, my phone chimed with a text from James. "Picking up Amanda on the way. Save us seats up front." Amanda was James's latest girlfriend, a woman he'd been dating for only a few months. I had met her briefly at the funeral. Bleached blonde hair, designer sunglasses even indoors, and a practiced sympathetic expression that never quite reached her eyes. The idea that James was bringing her to our father's will reading struck me as both inappropriate and telling. Thomas Wilson's law office occupied the top floor of a downtown building that Michel Construction had renovated a decade earlier. As I entered the elegant waiting room, Thomas himself came out to greet me, enfolding me in a grandfatherly hug. "Rachel, my dear, how are you holding up?" "I'm managing," I said, attempting a smile that probably looked as fragile as it felt. "Your father was so proud of you," he said, keeping his hands on my shoulders. "Never forget that." Something in his tone, a certain significance, made me look at him more closely. But before I could ask what he meant, the elevator dinged, and James strode in with Amanda on his arm. "Tommy," he exclaimed with forced joviality. "Sorry if we're a few minutes late, traffic was brutal." Thomas stiffened almost imperceptibly at the overfamiliar nickname. "James, we're still waiting for your Aunt Martha and Frank Peterson, whom your father asked to be present." James frowned. "Frank, the project manager. Why would Dad want him here?" "All will become clear shortly," Thomas said diplomatically. "Please, make yourselves comfortable. My assistant will bring refreshments." James and Amanda settled into the leather sofa, immediately beginning a whispered conversation punctuated by glances around the expensive office. "Just wait until you see the house," I overheard James telling her. "The master suite is incredible. We'll need to update some things, of course. My sisters had the run of the place while Dad was sick, but once it's officially mine." I turned away, focusing instead on the arrival of Aunt Martha, who hugged me tightly before taking the seat beside me. Frank arrived moments later, looking uncomfortable in a suit instead of his usual work clothes, nodding respectfully to everyone. Finally, Thomas emerged from his inner office carrying a thick folder. "If everyone is ready, we can begin." We filed into the conference room, Thomas at the head of the table, James and Amanda to his right, Aunt Martha, Frank, and I to his left. The tension in the room was palpable as Thomas adjusted his reading glasses and opened the folder. "We are here for the reading of the last will and testament of Robert James Michel," he began formally. "Before I proceed, I want to note that Robert made these arrangements with great care and after much consideration. He asked me specifically to remind everyone present that his decisions were made with full awareness and clear intent." James shifted impatiently in his seat. Yes, all the standard legal language. Can we get to the actual distribution?" Thomas gave him a measured look over his glasses. "As you wish." The preliminaries were indeed standard revocation of previous wills, appointment of executors Thomas and, to my surprise, me, payment of debts and taxes. Then came the specific bequest. "To my sister, Martha Green, I leave the sum of $100,000, with my eternal gratitude for her support and love throughout my life, especially during Grace's illness and after her passing." And Martha dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "To Frank Peterson, whose loyalty and expertise have been invaluable to Michel Construction, I leave the sum of $50,000 and my complete collection of woodworking tools, which I hope will bring him as much joy in retirement as they brought me." Frank looked stunned, then deeply moved. "I never expected," he murmured. Thomas continued through several smaller bequests to friends and charities before reaching the major assets. "Now, regarding the primary estate," he said, his voice taking on a more deliberate tone. "The family residence at 427 Maple Street, including all furnishings and personal effects not otherwise specified, I leave to my daughter, Rachel Michel." The room went absolutely still. I felt a buzzing in my ears, uncertain I had heard correctly. Beside me, Aunt Martha squeezed my hand. "That can't be right," James interrupted, leaning forward. "The house always goes to the eldest." "If I may continue," Thomas said firmly. "Regarding Michel Construction Company, I hereby bequeath 80% of all shares and full voting control to my daughter, Rachel Michel, who has demonstrated unwavering commitment to the business and has effectively been running it for some time." James half rose from his chair. "What?" "The remaining 20% of shares in Michel Construction are to be held in a non-voting trust for my son, James Michel, with distributions of profits to be made quarterly. However, these shares cannot be sold, transferred, or borrowed against without the express written permission of the majority shareholder." Amanda's hand, which had been resting on James's arm, slowly withdrew. "This is ridiculous," James sputtered, now fully standing. "Dad wouldn't do this. He always said the Michel name and business would stay together." "There is more," Thomas continued steadily, unruffled by the outburst. "I have also established a trust fund for James Michel in the amount of $500,000, to be distributed in annual payments of $50,000 over 10 years, contingent upon my son maintaining gainful employment, verified quarterly, and remaining free of any substance abuse issues, also to be verified by random testing." James's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "Employment, drug testing, what is this, some kind of sick joke?" "Additionally," Thomas pressed on, "I have left a personal letter for each of my children, to be read privately." He extracted 2 sealed envelopes from the folder and set them on the table. I'm contesting this, James declared, pointing an accusing finger at Thomas. You manipulated him when he was sick and vulnerable. This would never hold up in court. Thomas removed his glasses and regarded James with a steady gaze. Your father anticipated you might say that. Which is why he instructed me to inform you that if you contest any portion of this will, a codicil will be triggered that revokes all bequests to you and redirects those assets to the Riverdale Community Foundation. James fell back into his seat, visibly deflating. Furthermore, Thomas added, your father documented extensively his reasons for these decisions, including detailed records of the nearly $300,000 in loans he provided to you over the years, none of which were repaid. He also retained evidence of an unauthorized attempt you made to access company accounts in 2018, which he chose not to pursue legally at the time. The color drained from James's face as quickly as it had appeared. Amanda, sensing the sudden shift in financial prospects, made a show of checking her watch. I have a work thing, she murmured to James. Maybe I should go. He didn't even acknowledge her as she gathered her purse and slipped out of the room. I sat in stunned silence, trying to process everything I'd just heard. Dad had left me the house, the business, his trust, his legacy. Rachel, Thomas said gently, would you like a moment before we continue with the remaining detail? I shook my head, still unable to form words. Across the table, James stared at his hands, the fight gone out of him entirely. As Thomas proceeded with the technical aspects of the estate, I opened the envelope with my name on it, my father's familiar handwriting bringing fresh tears to my eyes. My dearest Rachel, it began, if you're reading this, I've moved on to whatever comes next, hopefully to be reunited with your mother. I want you to know that this decision wasn't made because of illness or pressure. I've known for years that you were the right person to carry on what I built, not because you're my daughter, but because you earned it through dedication, intelligence, and heart. The letter continued for several pages, filled with wisdom, memories, and hopes for my future. By the time I finished reading, Thomas had concluded the formal proceedings, and the room had emptied except for Aunt Martha, who waited patiently nearby. He knew, I said softly, folding the letter carefully. He knew all along what James was doing, what he was saying. Your father wasn't a fool, Aunt Martha replied, coming to sit beside me. He saw everything, even when he pretended not to, and he made his choices accordingly. As we left the office together, I spotted James sitting alone on a bench in the lobby, his expression vacant. For the first time since we were children, I felt no anger toward him, only a profound sadness for what could have been. James, I said, stopping in front of him, we should talk, not today but soon. He looked up, his face a complex mixture of emotions. What's there to talk about? You won, you got everything. This isn't about winning, I said quietly. It's about responsibility. Dad entrusted me with his legacy, and that includes taking care of his son. I held out a card with my number on it. When you're ready to talk, really talk, call me. He took the card automatically but said nothing as I walked away, stepping into the sunshine of a world that had irrevocably changed. The conference room felt impossibly quiet after James stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Aunt Martha squeezed my hand again, a gesture of silent support that meant more than any words could have. There's something else your father wanted you to know, Rachel, Thomas said, pulling another document from his folder. Something he thought best to share after James had left. My heart beat faster. What is it? 2 years ago, Robert came to me with concerns about some financial irregularities at Michel Construction. Money was disappearing, small amounts at first, then increasingly larger sums. He hired a forensic accountant who traced the missing funds to a series of unauthorized transfers. I frowned, already suspecting where this was heading. James? Thomas nodded gravely. James had been using company accounts to cover personal debts, gambling mostly, some questionable investments. When your father confronted him privately, James begged for another chance. Said he'd pay everything back. Did he? I asked, though I already knew the answer. No, Robert covered the missing money himself and kept it off the books to protect James's reputation. But he also installed new financial safeguards and removed James's access to any account. Frank, who had remained silent until now, cleared his throat. That's when your dad made me promise never to approve any financial requests from James, no matter what. Said it was for James's own good. This revelation shouldn't have surprised me, yet it still felt like another blow. Why didn't he tell me? He didn't want to damage your relationship with your brother any further, Thomas explained. He hoped James would turn things around on his own. But he didn't, I concluded. No, Thomas agreed. In fact, 6 months ago, while your father was already ill, we discovered James attempting to forge your father's signature on loan documents, using the business as collateral. I gasped, "That's criminal." "Yes," Thomas said solemnly. "Your father could have pressed charges. Instead, he chose this path, structuring his will to protect both the business and James from himself." The trust fund with employment requirements and substance testing suddenly made perfect sense. Dad wasn't punishing James. He was trying to save him from his worst impulses while ensuring he would always have a safety net. As I drove home to Dad's house, now my house, I tried to process everything I'd learned. The scope of Dad's foresight, his quiet management of a situation I'd only partially understood, left me feeling both comforted and overwhelmed by the responsibility he'd entrusted to me. I was unlocking the front door when a car screeched into the driveway. James emerged, still wearing his funeral suit, now rumpled and askew. "We're not done," he shouted, striding toward me. "I'm calling another lawyer. This whole thing stinks." I stood my ground on the porch. "You heard Thomas. Contest the will, and you get nothing." "You turned him against me," James accused, pointing a finger that trembled slightly. "All those months taking care of him," whispering in his ear. "Stop it, James," I said firmly. "You know that's not true. I was there because you were. I took care of him because you couldn't be bothered unless you needed money." "That's not fair. I had my own life, my own problems." "Yes, problems you created, problems Dad kept cleaning up for you." My composure finally broke. "Do you have any idea what he did for you?" "He covered up your embezzlement, James. He protected you from criminal charges when you forged his signature." James stepped back as if I'd slapped him, the color draining from his face. "How did you?" "Thomas told me everything after you left. Dad knew what you were doing. He always knew." He never said anything." James's voice had lost its accusatory edge, replaced by confusion. "Because he loved you," I said, softening my tone. "Despite everything, he loved you and wanted to protect you. Even from yourself." James sank onto the porch steps, head in his hands. For a moment, he looked like the little boy I remembered from childhood, lost, vulnerable, seeking approval he never felt he received. "What am I supposed to do now?" he asked, his voice barely audible. I sat beside him, maintaining a careful distance. "Start over. Use the trust fund as it was intended, as support while you build something real. Find work that matters to you, not just ways to make quick money." "Who's going to hire me at my age with my resume?" he scoffed. "Michelle Construction has an opening," I said after a moment's consideration. "Entry-level project coordinator. You'd have to earn the respect of every person there, including me. No special treatment, no shortcuts." He looked up, suspicion warring with hope in his expression. "Why would you do that?" "Because that's what Dad would want. And because despite everything, you're still my brother." James said nothing for a long time, staring out at the neighborhood where we'd both grown up. Finally, he stood and brushed off his pants with a defeated gesture. "I need to think," he said, "about everything." "Take your time," I replied. "The offer won't expire." As I watched him drive away, more carefully this time, I wondered if this moment marked a genuine turning point or just another temporary contrition that would fade with the next temptation. Only time would tell. The following days brought a flurry of activity as I officially assumed leadership of Michelle Construction. The employees, already accustomed to my management style, adapted quickly to the transition. Most expressed relief that the business would continue along the path we'd established. At home, I began the bittersweet task of sorting through Dad's belongings. In his study, I discovered a journal he kept during his illness, part business notes, part personal reflections. Many entries mentioned me with pride, detailing contributions I'd made that I hadn't realized he'd noticed. Some entries expressed regret about James, questioning where he had gone wrong as a father, wondering if his efforts to protect his son had ultimately enabled his worst behavior. The most poignant entry came just 2 weeks before his death. "Spoke with Thomas again today. Finalized everything. Rachel will be hurt that I kept James's financial troubles from her, but I hope she'll understand my reasons. As for James, this is my last chance to help him become the man I know he can be. I won't be here to see if it works, but I have to try. I couldn't leave this world knowing I gave up on my son, no matter how many times he's given up on himself." Tears blurred my vision as I closed the journal. Even at the end, facing his own mortality, Dad had been thinking of both his children, trying to do right by us in the ways he thought best. A week after the will reading, I received an unexpected visit from Amanda, James's now ex-girlfriend. "I'm just here to pick up some things James left at your father's house," she explained awkwardly on the doorstep. I invited her in, curious about her sudden appearance. "James and I broke up," she volunteered as I led her to the guest room where James occasionally stayed. "He's not in a good place right now." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, not entirely sure if I meant it. Amanda paused, hand on the doorknob. "You should know he's been talking about contesting the will again, found some lawyer who says he has a case because your dad was on heavy medication." My stomach tightened. "Is that why you're really here, to tell me that?" She had the grace to look embarrassed. "Partly, also," she hesitated. "James owes me money, a lot of it. I thought maybe you could." "I see," the pieces fell into place. "I'm sorry, Amanda, but I can't get involved in James's personal debts. If he chooses to contest the will, that's his decision to make." After she left, I called Thomas immediately to warn him about James's potential challenge. His response was measured but confident. "Let him try," Thomas said. "We have video of your father explaining his decisions while of sound mind, months before the heavy medications began, plus the financial evidence, the forged documents. If James forces this into the open, it won't end well for him." I spent that night on the porch, sitting in Dad's favorite chair, wrestling with my options. I could fight James if he pursued this path, expose his misconduct publicly, and ensure he lost everything Dad had tried to preserve for him. Or I could try once more to reach him, to help him see what Dad had seen, the potential for redemption that still existed if he would only grasp it. The next morning, I drove to James's apartment, prepared for another confrontation. What I found instead was my brother surrounded by empty bottles, unwashed clothes, and a general air of desperation. "Go away," he muttered when he saw me at the door. "I'm busy." "Planning your legal strategy?" I asked, stepping inside despite his protest. Amanda told me. Something flickered across his face, anger, shame, or perhaps a mixture of both. She had no right. "James, listen to me," I said, picking my way through the chaos to sit across from him. "This path ends with you losing everything: the trust fund, your shares in the company, any relationship with what's left of your family. Is that really what you want?" "What I want," he said bitterly, "is what should have been mine." "Based on what?" "Your years of dedication to the business, your care for Dad during his illness, your responsible financial management." The words came out harsher than I intended, but I couldn't stop. "You spent your entire adult life taking from him and giving nothing back. Now you want to dishonor his final wishes out of spite." James winced. "It's not that simple." "Then explain it to me. Help me understand why you feel entitled to destroy what he built." For a long moment, James said nothing, his expression unreadable. Then, unexpectedly, he began to cry, silent tears streaming down his unshaven face. "I can't be him," he finally said, voice breaking. "I tried, Rachel. When we were kids, I tried so hard to be what he wanted, but I could never measure up. You were always better student, better worker, better everything, so I stopped trying." The raw honesty of his admission caught me off guard. For the first time, I glimpsed the profound insecurity that had driven so many of his self-destructive choices. "Dad didn't want you to be him," I said gently. "He just wanted you to be your best self. And it's not too late for that." "Isn't it?" James looked around at the wreckage of his apartment, a mirror of the wreckage of his life. "Look at me, Rachel. I'm 45 years old with nothing to show for it except debts and burned bridges." "Then build new bridges," I suggested, "starting with me." I laid out a proposal: no lawyers, no contests, just a fresh start. James would accept the terms of the will, enter a treatment program for the drinking problem he refused to acknowledge but clearly had, and afterward, if he still wanted it, a job at Michel Construction where he would start at the bottom and work his way up based solely on merit. "Why would you do this after everything?" he asked suspiciously. "Because Dad never gave up on you," I answered honestly. "And I don't want to either." 3 days later, James entered a 30-day residential treatment program. I paid for it not from company funds, but from my own savings. It was an investment in the brother I hoped might still emerge from the shadows of resentment and entitlement. Whether it would pay off remained to be seen. 1 year after Dad's death, I stood in the backyard of the family home, my home now, watching guests mingle at the small gathering I'd organized in his memory. Michel Construction employees past and present, longtime clients, friends, and family had come together to celebrate the legacy of Robert Michel. The house had changed subtly over the months. I'd preserved Dad's study exactly as he left it, but other rooms had been gradually updated, reflecting my own taste while honoring the history within these walls. The business had evolved too, expanding into green building initiatives, establishing a scholarship for young women entering construction trades, launching a mentorship program for at-risk youth interested in learning practical skills. Dad would have been proud, I thought. Not just of the business achievements, but of the deeper changes that had taken place within our fractured family. James stood across the yard, deep in conversation with Frank about a project they were collaborating on. After completing treatment, my brother had indeed taken the entry-level position I'd offered. The first months had been rocky. Years of entitlement didn't disappear overnight. There were setbacks, arguments, and moments when I questioned my decision to give him another chance. But gradually, something shifted. Perhaps it was the simple dignity of earning his own way, or the slow building respect from colleagues who initially viewed him with justified skepticism. Whatever the catalyst, James began to change. He showed up early, stayed late, asked questions instead of making assumptions, and most importantly, took responsibility for his mistakes instead of deflecting blame. 6 months in, he'd earned his first promotion on merit alone. By the 1-year mark, he had become a valuable team member not because of his name, but despite it. Our relationship had evolved too, though more cautiously. The wounds of the past couldn't be erased by a single year of improved behavior. Trust, once broken so thoroughly, could only be rebuilt slowly, through consistent actions rather than promises. But we were making progress, finding our way back to something resembling the sibling bond we'd had as children, before competition and resentment had poisoned it. And Martha approached, interrupting my reflections. "Penny, for your thoughts." I smiled, just thinking about how much has changed. How much Dad would have loved seeing all these people here, celebrating his life instead of mourning his death. "He would have loved seeing you and James talking again even more," she observed, nodding toward my brother. "That's the real miracle." "I don't know if I'd go that far," I cautioned. "We're still finding our way." "But you're trying, both of you. That's what Robert always hoped for." She squeezed my arm affectionately. "He made the right choice, leaving things to you." "I know," I said, and realized I truly did know it now, without the shadow of doubt that had lingered for so long. Though sometimes I wish he'd told James the truth sooner, about the embezzlement, about his plans for the business. Maybe things would have been different. Or maybe they would have been worse, Aunt Martha suggested. "Your father was protecting James the only way he knew how." "By enabling him," I said with a sigh. "Perhaps," she acknowledged. "But also by believing that somewhere inside that entitled, angry man was still the boy who could be better if given the right guidance." And look, he wasn't entirely wrong. Across the yard, James caught my eye and raised his glass in a small salute. I returned the gesture, feeling a complicated mixture of emotions that had become familiar over the past year, cautious hope tempered by hard-earned wisdom. Later, as the gathering wound down and guests began to depart, James lingered, helping me collect glasses and plates despite my assurance that the caterers would handle cleanup. "Dad would have liked this," he said, echoing my earlier thoughts. Low-key, focused on the good memory. "Yes," I agreed. "He never did like being the center of attention." We worked in companionable silence for a few minutes before James spoke again. "I found a place," he said, "a condo downtown. I'm moving next month." I looked up, surprised. James had been living in the pool house since completing treatment, a temporary arrangement that had somehow stretched to 9 months. "That's great, big step." "It's time," he said simply. "I can't keep living in your shadow, literally or figuratively." The old James would have made this sound like an accusation. The new James just stated it as a fact, without resentment or blame. "I've been thinking a lot about inheritance lately," he continued, carefully stacking plates. "Not the money or property kind, but what Dad really left us." "Which was?" I prompted when he didn't elaborate. "Values," James said thoughtfully. "Work ethic, integrity, forgiveness." He met my eyes directly. "All the things I spent years pretending didn't matter while you were actually living them." The naked honesty in his voice caught me off guard. James had made strides over the past year, but emotional vulnerability had never been his strong suit. "It's not a competition, James," I said gently. "It never was, though I know it felt that way to you." "That was my doing, not yours," he acknowledged. I turned it into a rivalry because it was easier than admitting I wasn't willing to put in the work. We finished cleaning in silence, both processing the weight of his admission. As James prepared to leave, he hesitated at the door. "Thank you," he said finally. "Not just for the job or the second chance, but for not giving up on me. You could have, you know. Most people would have." "We're family," I said simply. "That still means something." After he left, I wandered through the quiet house, eventually finding myself in Dad's study. The leather chair still held the impression of his form, the bookshelves remained lined with his favorite volumes, the desk still organized according to his precise system. I ran my fingers over the smooth wood, feeling closer to him in this space than anywhere else. On an impulse, I opened the bottom drawer where I'd found his journal the year before. Beneath it lay an envelope I hadn't noticed previously, addressed simply, "For Rachel 1 year later." With trembling fingers, I opened it to find a single sheet of paper in Dad's handwriting. "My dearest Rachel, if you're reading this, a year has passed since I left you with burdens no daughter should have to bear: a business, a home, and a brother who has lost his way. I hope the weight hasn't been too heavy on your shoulders. I made my choices carefully, though I know they may have seemed harsh or unfair. What I couldn't fully explain was that the greatest inheritance I could leave James wasn't money or property, but the chance to become the man I always believed he could be, even when he didn't believe it himself. And the greatest inheritance I could leave you wasn't a business or a house, but the knowledge that you were always enough, exactly as you are. The true legacy we leave isn't in things, Rachel, but in values lived and lessons learned. In the courage to do what's right, even when it's difficult. In the wisdom to know that family is precious, even when it's complicated." I don't know where you and James stand as you read this. Perhaps nothing has changed. Perhaps everything has, but whatever has happened, know that I trust your judgment and your heart. You've never disappointed me, and you never will. All my love, Dad. I held the letter to my chest as tears flowed freely down my face. Even now, a year gone, Dad was still teaching me, still guiding me, still believing in me. What my father left me wasn't just property and a business, it was the understanding that true inheritance is about values, responsibility, and love. Material things are just symbols of the real legacy we leave behind. And that legacy continues, not just in buildings constructed or profits earned, but in broken relationships mended, in second chances offered and accepted, in the slow, imperfect process of becoming our better selves. As I carefully folded the letter and returned it to the drawer, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. Dad had trusted me to carry his legacy forward, and I would honor that trust not just in how I ran his business, but in how I lived my life. Before I leave you today, I'd like to ask, what meaningful inheritance have you received that wasn't about money or property? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear that second chances are always possible and that true healing can begin even after the deepest wounds. Thank you for joining me on this journey of remembrance and renewal. Until next time, remember that the most valuable things we inherit are the lessons that shape who we become.